Okay, so let's talk about atheism, agnosticism, secularity, and the nuns. So at the very beginning of this semester, I talked a little bit about this category of non-believer. I'm going to use that term loosely, called the nuns. And they're called the nuns because when these surveys come out, they often give you choices for religious preference, or and including things like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, big global religions, right? But if you can't fill out any of the choices, then you select the bubble that says none, right? And so this class, the nuns, talks about the nuns, and the nuns encompasses all of these different things. And let me just show you. Here are a few famous nuns. These are probably the most well-known atheists in the world. Let's see, on the far left, we have Richard Dawkins, a biologist, right? Probably the most famous atheist. And then we have Daniel Dennett, a philosopher who just died a couple of years ago. And Richard Dawkins, the third guy, was a journalist. He died about 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. And then Sam Harris. And I'm not sure, I know he's a scientist, maybe a physicist. I'm drawing a blank right now. But these guys are called the four horsemen of new atheism, right? So they are the most associated with atheism because they're always constantly going out, or did constantly go out and debate with theists, people who believe in God, usually Christian or Muslims. They go out and hold these debates in order to puncture their arguments. And they're pretty infamous because the new atheists, the term new atheism is a term to describe these atheists who not only atheists, but also are considered to be anti-theists. So not only are they themselves don't believe, or they are non-believers, non-theists, but they are also anti-theists. They believe that God, the concept of God, or religion as a phenomenon, is a negative thing and something that should be criticized. Now they are very, very vocal, but they actually make a minority of atheists and agnostics and non-believers. It's just everybody associates atheism with these guys because they're so vocal, right? So we're going to talk a little bit more about the new atheists, but we'll also talk about groups like Sunday Assembly, right? So if you go to a Sunday Assembly meeting, this started about 10 years ago in London. But now it's all over Europe and the United States. You go to these meetings and they look a lot like Protestant worship services, right? People singing together. There's something that looks like a sermon, but instead of a theological sermon on the Bible or theology, it is more usually something like a scientific presentation about, something to do with science. And these people, they are agnostics or atheists, but they look a lot different than the new atheists, and they are not vocally against religion. And many times groups like this, we can find them actually working together with religious groups for like social issues, charitable things, right? Okay. And then we have what are called non-realist religions. And these are groups that don't believe in God, don't believe in the supernatural, but consider themselves to be part of these larger religious traditions. So this is Stephen Batchelor. He started non-real, well, he didn't start it, but he's a major proponent and writer about what's called non-realist Buddhism. And this is the idea of Buddhism, but it ignores the metaphysical supernatural elements of Buddhism, like karma or reincarnation. And then, so Buddhism has a long history of, it's not necessarily atheism, but just this recognition that gods can't help you, at least in the Theravada forms of Buddhism, can't help you to reach enlightenment. So this isn't seen as too unusual a step in Buddhism, but we also see there are non-realist forms of Christianity, right? And when the people who say that they're Christians, but they don't believe in God, they are atheists, and they don't believe in the divinity of Christ. So we'll talk about these non-realists. During this lecture, we'll talk about terminology. Who are the nuns? We'll get an idea of the variety of atheists and agnostics that are out there. We'll talk about a history of non-belief, the what's called the atheist agnostic continuum, and if we have time, a little bit about non-realist religions and parody religions. Okay, so here are some terms. Secularism, of course, is something that we hear quite often, but secularism does not necessarily mean non-religious or atheist. It's just any movement in society which is directed away from the metaphysical or otherworldliness to life on earth. Right? So we live in a secular society in the sense that we have a strict separation of religion and the state. So you can maintain secularist ideals, right? You could be fervently for the separation of church and state, these secular ideas, but still be a religious person, still be a faithful Jew or a Christian or a Muslim. All right, so that's secularism. Then, of course, we have theism, being the belief in a god or gods. And then the nuns encompass these things, several different types of nuns. We have atheists, we'll talk about atheists, agnostics, secular scientific humanists, and spiritual, relatively new term, spiritual but not religious, which is very popular. It's so self-identifying yourself as you don't regard organized religion as the sole and most valuable means of spiritual growth. All right, so let's first one, in terms of the number of nuns, we can see back in 1976, so about 50 years ago, in the United States, only 7% of the population in the United States filled out this thing on their forms, this particular general social survey. And the general social survey is a massive survey that happens every few years, where they get all this demographic information about people in the United States. And only 7% in 1976. We're seeing in 2016, and that was 10 years ago. There's even more. I'm not sure what the number is, percentages today, but just 10 years ago, it was 24% of people in the United States identified as nuns. So over 50 years, it's been a massive growth. So if we look all right, this slide says, as the nuns share the population has increased, the Christian share has declined. So currently 43% of the US adults identify with Protestantism. This is down from 51% in 2009. And 1 in 5 adults, 20% are Catholic, down from 23% in 2009. So as the share of the nuns increases, Christianity, still the largest religion in the United States, has been steadily dropping. All right, so who are the nuns? The actual number that says that they're atheists is very small percentage of people who are filling out these surveys, and it's only 12%. More are agnostic, but most say people, when asked to elaborate, they'll say nothing. They're nothing in particular. Okay, so there was a study, University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, in 2013, by this guy Christopher Silver, and I think this was part for his dissertation. And what he did was he did a qualitative study in which he just he decided to determine, you know, what different categories these nuns fall into. This is one of several different surveys, but what Silver found was these are the major categories of nuns. We have what are called the intellectual atheists or agnostic. And intellectual atheists or agnostic are people who, according to Silver, proactively seek to educate themselves through intellectual association and proactively acquire knowledge on various topics relating to ontology, the search for truth, and non-belief. Right? These are not the anti-theists. So they enjoy good debate, but they enjoy good, healthy, and civil debate, and discussions. And I think they're motivated to engage in these things. Right. And then we have what are called activist atheists or agnostics. And these are people that are not content with holding a non-belief position. They also seek to be vocal about something else, activist about humanism or feminism or LGBT issues, social political issues, etc. And then there's the seeker agnostic. Seeker agnostics they're agnostic, so they don't know. The term agnostic means not to claim no knowledge, not to know. And so if you are agnostic, you don't know whether God exists. And then seeker agnostics, but they really have no firm ideological position about whether God exists or not. But they actively engage in the search for knowledge in order to understand more. To try to find an answer, at least for themselves. We talked about anti-theists. Anti-theists not only are atheists, but they are against religion and see religion as detrimental to society. Non-theists is a very small category. And these are people who just don't care one way or another. Right? They're apathetic non-believers. So, for example, if you ask them and say, I don't care. And so it's actually a very, very small number of people. So, when you're a newborn child, you may be classified as a non-theist, as an infant. All right, and then we have ritual atheists or agnostics. And ritual atheists or agnostics, that's like the Sunday assembly that I talked about. These are people who they're atheists, they don't believe in God, or they're agnostics, they don't know if God exists or not, right? But they enjoy the ritual and community aspects of religion and try to maintain those. So the Sunday assembly people meet every Sunday in order to have to meet in a community and in order to engage in the ritual, even though they are not themselves believers in any sort of higher power. Same could be said for some like Christian non-realist religions. They still maintain they go to church, but they themselves don't believe in God. All right, so if we look at all these types, the largest group is the type 1 academics, right? So against, the popular idea, and it's because again, the anti-theists are so vocal, is that atheists hate religion, but that's really not the truth. There are, of course, atheists and anti-theists who are anti-theists, but there are groups like academic, intellectual atheists and seeker agnostics that don't have a beef with religion. They just themselves don't believe it. And then many times they can actively and do actively work with with religions to get humanistic type goals done. All right, so in terms of history, we've seen some different approaches, unorthodox approaches to the idea of theism over the course of the semester. So in Hinduism, in ancient India, we didn't really talk about this specifically, but at about the same time that Buddhism and Jainism started, around the 6th century BCE, there was another sect, and it's no longer, it was kind of died out, but it's either called the Lokayata or sometimes it's called the Karma sects, and they were strictly materialists, right? So they were strictly atheists, did not believe in gods, did not believe in karma, did not believe in the truth of the Vedas, no supernaturalism at all, right? Strict materialist. They didn't last long because the groups like Buddhists and Jains and Hindus, they thought they were idiotic, right? They just completely couldn't understand the Lokayata approach. So they seemed completely irrational. And then in Buddhism, like Buddhism does, of course, believe in God, but in the oldest forms of Buddhism, as we saw, belief in a God is not going to get you to enlightenment. Ultimately, the nibbana is going to be achieved through your own efforts. Jainism is also very similar to Buddhism in that way, that they don't really believe in the ability of gods in order for you to reach enlightenment. Okay, so we talked about China, and we talked about Confucius. And Confucius believed in gods, I'm pretty sure, but as we said, there's very little indication of God in his teachings. And he would talk about heaven, Tian, but not really about gods. And when he was asked about gods, he would say, what's the use of worrying about the gods when we've got so much here to worry about on this earth? Okay, so in ancient Greece and Rome, there's not much evidence of actual atheism in the sense of the word as it's used today, but definitely there was ridicule of traditional religious beliefs, particularly beliefs in the Greek pantheon of Zeus and all other gods. And this ridicule was typically aimed at the gods or aimed at believers by philosophers. Not saying that the philosophers themselves were not atheists, right? But they thought that the stories, the mythology of the peers, this popular mythology was it was just the stories, right? And so they would talk about things, posit these metaphysical explanations for why things were the way they were, and tried to move beyond these traditional ideas of gods and titans. So, for example, Aristotle, he in his science, he says that everything has a cause, right? And so if a ball is flying through the air, the cause is a person throwing the ball. The cause for the person is their parents and back, and you can keep tracing one effect, cause and effect, all the way back. So Aristotle, his idea of God was that God, so there has to always be a cause, but there also has to be a start to things, right? So there has to be a first cause, and he called God the prime mover. So it's a very different idea than, say, Zeus. You can see God in Aristotle's estimation being more like an engine that gets things going, sets things in motion. It's this prime mover, right? And it really doesn't have characteristics like a god, like Zeus or Hera or Athena. So it's just this first mover. And basically, what Aristotle was, he was, this is an instance of what we call the God of the gaps, right? When you don't have an explanation for why something happens or how something started, then you attribute it to God. We also have these philosophers called the Sophists, and the Sophists had very diverse views on the gods and religion, but they tended to be antagonistic to traditional religion. So this Protagoras was probably the most famous sophist, and he's famous for saying this man is the measure of all things. So the sophists had a very relativistic view of reality, and that truth is very subjective, right? Then we have Christians, and in Rome, Christians, the term atheist was, I think I've said this before, but the term atheist was used for Christians because Christians refused to, while they had this God, the pagans didn't understand them because they refused to pray to any other gods, which was completely alien to the Romans. So they oftentimes labeled themselves as atheists. They didn't label themselves, but labeled by the pagans as atheists. Now, in the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, you're going to see I didn't have a slide on that because there was no really intellectually sophisticated view of what atheism was in the Middle Ages. I mean, there were skeptical people, people that were incredulous about religion. But the church had so much power during the Middle Ages that it was dangerous in order to be too vocal about it. So there was no real philosophical discourse about the existence of God. But when you get to Renaissance, the Renaissance period, right? In the Renaissance, thinkers started, and artists and poets and writers started looking back before the Middle Ages to the ancient world, ancient Greece and Rome, for inspiration. And because of this, they developed what's called humanism, right? And Renaissance humanism is an attempt to revive this ancient culture through literature and education. So Petrarch was one of these Renaissance thinkers, right? I would say all the Renaissance, the major Renaissance thinkers like Petrarch were themselves faithful Christians, right? But they were also humanists. So while they were Christians, they developed these ideas about man's inherent abilities and greatness, right? So what they did was they set this focus on humanity, they set sort of the foundation for what later would come in the development of atheist and agnostic ideas, right? And this would happen, start really getting rolling in the Enlightenment. Okay. So during the Enlightenment, we have the first real philosophical exploration and examination of God and the possibility that there is no God, right? So we talked, Herbert Cherbury really at the beginning of the semester, but he's the one who came up with these 5 common principles of what God is. And so he believed in God, but you can see by Herbert of Cherbury's principles that he does not, his principles aren't, they are broader than just the Abrahamic God, right? So he is seeing God in a more general sense. So he's called the father of deism, right? So this is something that was developed during the Enlightenment, this idea that, yeah, there is a God, a creator God, but the creator God is sort of a celestial architect, right? Who created everything and then just stepped back from it and then had nothing to do with the universe after that, right? So wound up the clock, and what created the clock wound it up and then let it go, right? That's what deism is. Thomas Jefferson, one of the most famous deists, many of the early the whatever the people like Thomas Jefferson, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, they were deists. And Thomas Jefferson, he wrote a book, the Jefferson Bible. It's very interesting. You can read it online. And what he did was he took the Gospels and he removed everything from the Gospel that had to do with the supernatural or miracles. So this was an attempt sort of to, again, this humanism, right? It's being expressed in this form of deism. He's trying to what in his idea, rescue these ethical parts of Christianity and remove the metaphysical parts. Here are 2 other very important thinkers. Baruch Spinoza, he was a Dutch Jew and a philosopher, and he was a pantheist. So he believed that everything was God. God was immanent in all creation. God was not a personal Abrahamic God, but since everything was God, this is a sort of a monist idea that all reality is God. All reality is comprised of the same substance, whether it be a human being or a computer monitor. We're all comprised of this substance that just is expressed in different ways. Right? So he saw no distinction between God and nature. Baron de Holbach, he was a philosopher and writer on politics and ethics. And he was also one of the first anti-theists. So he would write against Christianity, particularly, and then also against, the very notion of God and why people shouldn't believe it. And so what Holbach did was he would write on many subjects using his name, but when he was writing his anti-theism, he would use a pen name because it was still kind of dangerous, even during the Enlightenment, in order to say things that were anti-theists. Okay, and then in the 19th century, we have the development of social science. And we have several different, very important social scientists who, as part of their understanding of trying to understand how the social world works, they have to fit in the idea of why there's God, right? Why the notion of God exists, why humans what humans use the notion of God for. And they can't, so being social scientists, they're not going to give a theological explanation. Right. So for sociology, we have this guy, Ludwig Feuerbach. No, not sociology, sorry, anthropology. And he came up with this idea called the theory of alienation. And he said that God is created by human beings, in which they alienate their best qualities, human qualities like love, wisdom, knowledge, they alienate those qualities from themselves and place it onto some sort of invented mythological celestial being, God, right, as a reflection of those qualities. So he called this the theory of alienation. Right. So humans will create God in their own image in order to worship the best parts of their human nature. All right, then we have Karl Marx. And so what Karl Marx did was he took Feuerbach's idea of alienation and he applied it to politics. Economics. So he said, there are classes in society. So we have what's the class of capitalists, and then we have bourgeois, he called them, and then we have a class of the proletariat. And the proletariat is being exploited by the capitalists, right? Their labor is being exploited. So what Marx was saying is saying that God is not created by alienation, but he took that idea of alienation and applied it to this exploitation of labor. The workers' labor is being stolen from them by the capitalists. So that's what he said. All right. But then he said religion is an ideology. It's a false ideology which is used in order to keep the exploited workers from realizing their exploitation or rebelling against their exploitation. Right? They do this. He said that the function of religion is to say, well, this life is terrible. I'm working in this factory, but there's an afterlife waiting for me if I'm a good person and I do what I'm supposed to do. That's where we get him saying that religion is the opium of the masses. He would say it was an ideology, which is essentially just acting as a drug to keep you in a subservient state. And then we have Sigmund Freud. He lived into the mid-20th century and is known as the father of modern psychiatry or psychoanalysis. And he had a very simple explanation for God. He was saying that God, he called God or God's the divine father, saying that when we're children, we look to our own human father as for safety and protection, and that we extend this idea when we're adults. We still look for safety and protection, but we do this from this celestial divine father, saying this that the God is a creation of the mind in order to look for safety. Okay, and then in the 20th century, one of the major thinkers is Bertrand Russell. He was a philosopher, and he believed, well, he called himself an agnostic, and he wrote a famous essay called Why I Am Agnostic. He was a popular philosopher. Right? So many people who were outside of the academy read his philosophy. He wrote for a popular audience. And he created what's called teapot agnosticism. So what Bertrand, and it's very, very close to atheism. I would say that most atheists today are actually teapot agnostics, right? So what Bertrand Russell said, he said, imagine that between the Earth and Mars in orbit around the sun is a teapot, right? And he said, this teapot, he said there was a possibility. What if there's a possibility there's a teapot? Not necessarily that there is. There could be a teapot floating between the Earth and Mars, right? I could believe in this teapot, but Bertrand Russell says he chooses not to believe in the teapot floating between Earth and Mars because of the improbability of it and the lack of evidence, right? So he said he transfers this idea of the teapot to God. He said God is this teapot. I mean, people claim that there's this God, but there's as much evidence in Bertrand Russell's mind for God as there is for this teapot floating between the Earth and Mars. But what Bertrand Russell, he maintained that he was agnostic because he said, but I'm not saying, while I choose not to believe, I'm leaving the door open. So in the future, somebody may get this amazing telescope and actually see the teapot floating around. And the same thing, he said the same thing could happen with God. So he's not leaving out the possibility for future evidence, right? But for all intents and purposes, he is effectively, all practical purposes, Bertrand Russell would say that he's an atheist, right? But he recognizes the possibility for further evidence. But without that evidence, he chooses not to believe. All right, and then we have the new atheists. So here are those guys I talked about earlier, the four horsemen. Right, so they have a naturalist worldview, placed a strong emphasis on reason, rationality, and science. But they think that religion is irrational and pathological and is dangerous, right? So when you hear a new atheist talking, they will be running down religion. Usually it's in a debate format with a believer, and it's their entire goal is to prove the believer wrong, and not only prove them wrong, but prove why their belief negatively impacts humanity. Okay, so new atheists are politically active. They believe vociferously in the separation of church and state, legal and civic equality for atheists. So, asked, I believe it was Sam Harris, I'm not sure, but one of these guys, when asked why they're so vocal against religion, said that if we don't stand up for ourselves, who will? Right? And it can't be argued that there's a point there that being an atheist in the world can be a dangerous position. In the United States, it can be dangerous. Well, not in the United States, sorry. In the United States, it's not particularly dangerous to be an atheist. But if you're in Malaysia or Mauritania or Nigeria, you can be executed. There's 13 nations in the world which allow for execution of people who are atheist, right? Even in the United States, Texas is one of 7 states that has a state constitution that has language barring atheists from public office. Now, that line in these constitutions is void because of the U.S. Constitution overrules that, but this shows you this bias against atheism in the United States, even, and pretty much all over the world, right? And that's just why this is the reason the new atheists are against religion, right? They see it as self-defense. Okay, so let's talk about atheism, then we'll talk about agnosticism. So according to Prothero, the problem is ignorance. The solution is knowledge. The techniques are reason, science, skepticism, and critical inquiry. Exemplars are free thinkers who think for themselves rather than follow the secondhand teachings of prophets, messiahs, priests, or other authorities. In the United States, if we looked at what atheists look like in the United States, you can pretty much get a picture from these two surveys that were done. The first would be by Williamson and Yancey. And so they surveyed people in the United States, and they found that atheists were 93.8% white, 72.6% male, 48.9% over 45 years of age, 40.2% had a graduate degree. Then we had a Baylor religious study in 2007 that found basically the same thing. 96.4% white, 63.3% male, 35% over the 50 years of age. 23.7% had a graduate degree. 24.2% made more than $100,000 per year. Right. So if you were going to the United States, if you were going to say who is an atheist, you would say the typical atheist was a wealthy white guy, a wealthy older white guy, highly educated. But why? I mean, why does it pan out like this? Okay, so what William and Yancey say is that the reason that most, well, in their analysis, they say most atheists in the United States can be described as rich white guys with educations, lots of education, is because they enjoy majority group status. And so when you're in a majority group, it's much easier to be an atheist, right? So they say that they have this majority groups have been encouraged to think of themselves as being in a superior position to study reality. They are well educated and wealthy, which may help them have confidence that they have access to proper training and information. And they are older, male, and white, which may indicate they have been given a great deal of deference in their lives. Such confidence may help them to hold onto atheist beliefs in a society where such beliefs are still minority opinion, and it's harder to be an atheist if you're not in a privileged position. All right, because you are, as I said, as Yancey and Williamson argue, you're insulated from societal problems, so like your peers. It's just easier. Other reasons that they come up with in this study, 52.9% come from homes where there was no religion or where religion was very weakly practiced, and 33% lost their beliefs, at least in part due to experiences at college or university. So I've heard that going to college or university really results in either confirming your beliefs, or letting go or significantly changing your beliefs, because you're exposed to many different ideas. All right, here are some qualitative characteristics of American atheists from Williamson and Yancey. They say that they tend to have few doubts about their atheism. The influence of writings of other atheists. Therefore, atheism has been growing. One of the reasons they think atheism is growing in the recent decades is because it's easier to get a hold of writings because of the World Wide Web. And a de-emphasis on emotional reasons for their atheism. Okay, so we have atheism, but so what's agnosticism is not knowing, right? Acknowledging that you don't know, and you're not willing to make a decision on whether you believe in the existence of God or the supernatural. Right. So the guy who created the term agnosticism, which just means without knowledge, gnosis in Greek is knowledge. So agnostic means without knowledge. Is this guy Thomas Henry Huxley? And Huxley is also known as Darwin's bulldog. So he was against Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution until he actually met Charles Darwin, and then he converted and he became his greatest support. So he was always writing in support of Darwin. And he came up with this idea of philosophical agnosticism, right? Or being ignorant, not knowing. So there are many different types of atheism and agnosticism, as we've all already seen. But in terms of agnosticism, you have a basic division between what's called soft or weak agnosticism versus hard or strong agnosticism. Most people who claim to be agnostics are soft or weak agnostics. They don't know that God exists, but they believe in the possibility for either themselves finding out later that God exists or someone else knowing for sure that God exists. That's not excluded. Most agnostics are seeker agnostics, right? They're trying to figure it out. Then we have hard or strong agnostics, and this is actually a very small percentage of agnostics. They don't know whether gods exist, and they also think that no one can ever know whether gods exist or not. Right? So they don't believe that any evidence will ever be available. All right, so if we think about agnosticism and atheism, you can see it as a scale, right? And this is, I talked about Richard Dawkins. He's this anti-theist, this new atheist. And he came up with what's called the Dawkins scale. It's a 7-point scale that goes from strong. So it's a spectrum. He called it a spectrum of theistic probability. His most famous book is called The God Delusion, and this is where he introduced this. So what Dawkins said is that you have at the one end of the scale, you have the very strong theists who don't question the existence of God. They just know that God exists. And then you have de facto theists. They're not certain, but they strongly believe in God. Then you have weak theists, very uncertain, but they're inclined to believe in God. And then you have pure agnostics. And they think, well, either God exists or doesn't. There's equal possibility of both, but they just don't know. And then on near the other end of the scale, we have weak atheists. They're just inclined to be skeptical about the existence of God. De facto atheists cannot know for certain, but think God is very improbable. And then the strong atheists, they're 100% sure that there is no God. So I'm assuming Richard Dawkins would call himself a strong atheist. But again, I think there are very, very few strong atheists that are being 100% certain. Many, what I would call, or what Bertrand Russell would call teapot atheists, that hold out that yes, evidence could be provided. It is possible that evidence in the future can be provided. Okay, so we have atheists and agnostics. I'm going to talk about a group called the secular humanists, also called scientific humanists. And what secular humanists, this is a 20th century development phenomenon. They emphasize belief in the scientific method. So what they're doing is they're taking the humanism of the Renaissance humanism, right? They are maintaining their own agnosticism or atheism, but they're taking this humanism in order to expound a philosophy of life without gods It holds humans as fully responsible and accountable for their own fates or for their conditions of life. Okay. So this entails that they created ethics, right? So this is atheism or agnosticism with a moral compass, a very highly developed ethics, for the attempt to elevate humans in society, solve the world's problem. And this movement started with this lady. She's a psychologist, Margaret K. Knight, in the 1950s, 1955. She gave a BBC radio talk called Morals Without Religion. It was saying that you could have morals without believing in God. And this caused a huge stir in the press. And she was called all kinds of horrible, horrible names. But, from this type of work, we get societies of secular humanists and secular scientific humanists. So if you go, for example, to this particular one, I believe this is the secularhumanism.org, that you will find these lists of beliefs very similar to the lists that we find in places like the Bible, ethical beliefs, like we believe in, but without the presence of the supernatural or God. Like things like we believe in enjoying life here and now and in developing our creative talents to their fullest. We believe in the cultivation of moral excellence, right? So these are definitely not anti-theists. Secular humanists are definitely not anti-theists. They just look beyond, or they don't look to any sort of supernatural source for their ethics. Right? They maintain their atheism or agnosticism. So, could you claim that secular humanism is a religion? Many people have tried to make the case that things like secular humanism or the Sunday Assembly are themselves religions because they have very many different elements, or they have elements which are shared by religion. So, for example, the Sunday Assembly gathers on Sunday. They participate in ritualized communal behavior like singing. They have a shared identity. So this really goes back to our question that we asked at the very beginning of the semester. Is like, how do you define religion? And so if we were taking a theory of family or resemblances approach, you could say that secular humanists share many of the same elements that we see with Christianity or Islam. This guy here, he is Greg Epstein. He's actually a humanist chaplain at Harvard. So Harvard has humanist chaplains along with Christian chaplains. Okay, so then we get to non-realist religion. This is a particularly fascinating to me, and this is the belief that God, essentially they're atheists. They believe that God exists, but only in ideas and in language. So they say that God exists in the mind, but not in reality or as a thing, right? God exists because we make God exist through shared ideas in language. Right. So this is something that we saw with Feuerbach. And so God is just this personification of spiritual need and moral and ethical ideas. Here are just a few. So we talked about Stephen Batchelor, non-realist secular Buddhism. You can see that their symbol for secular Buddhism is the Dharma wheel, but it just has an S in the middle for secular. So, I mean, this really isn't a big deal for Buddhists being a secular Buddhist. It really isn't considered to be that strange among Buddhists today. But then you have non-realist secular Christianity, which does seem very strange because, if you think about the Nicene Creed, this is definitely a non-Nicene version of Christianity. And it really started getting rolling in the 70s with this guy named Don Coupet, and he's still alive. He's in his 90s. He was an Anglican minister, Anglican priest, and what happened was he was also an atheist. And they tried to kick him out of his parish, but his parish members in England, he was so popular they refused to let him be kicked out. Right, so he was a Anglican priest with no belief in God. And then he eventually left the priesthood and he started writing about this non-realist form of Christianity. His most famous book is called The Sea of Faith. And he would say that he said that a Christian non-realist is someone who follows the spiritual practices, certain spiritual practices, and rituals, and tries to live up to ethical standards of Christianity, but they don't believe in the God as a thing, right, beyond human ideas. So this is very similar to what Thomas Jefferson was doing with the Jefferson Bible, right? Stripping away, keeping the ethical basis in the gospel, but stripping away all mentions of the supernatural in God or miraculous. Don Cupid's still writing today. What he started became known as the Sea of Faith movement. It's very, very popular, particularly in the United Kingdom and in Canada. Okay, so Jewish atheism. See, as we talked about when we were talking about Judaism, you can be a Jew. I mean, if you're a Jew, being a Jew, that's a cultural, you're part of a cultural group, and you're also can be part of a religious group, right? But not, as we said, not all Jews have the same idea about God, right? And there are many Jews that consider themselves to be atheists or agnostic, but still consider themselves to be Jews. Okay. Now I just want to talk about a few modern parody religions. So a parody religion, it's a satirical religion. And the purpose is to poke fun, make fun of people who do engage in religious people, right? To point out the flaws in their thinking, right? And engage in satire, right? That doesn't mean if you're part of a parody religion that you don't believe in God, right? So this really isn't atheism. You can be atheist, and I would say many people who are in parody religions are atheists or agnostic. And what's interesting about parody religions is that as they develop, they start as parodies, but then over the decades, they start looking more and more like they're real religions. So, for example, the Church of the Subgenius, this is sort of the goat of parody religion. It was started in the 1970s by Ivan Stang. It's this crazy mishmash of all different beliefs taken from different religions and conspiracy theories. Their prophet is this kind of legendary salesperson named Bob or J.R. Bob Dobbs, right? And so that's him. Picture, they have a god named Jehovah One, who's actually kind of a mean guy, and they have one of their main, they believe in this idea of, or they say they believe in this idea of slack, but they never really define what it takes for something to be slack, and it is a positive thing if something is slack. And the opposite of slack is to be pink, right? So if that's a negative thing. So you want to do things that are slack. You don't want to engage in things that are pink. And what's interesting is that it starts as a clear parody religion, but then over the decades, there have been schisms within the Church of the Subgenius, right? And started like the same thing that we saw with Christianity and Islam. So this is probably the most well-known today, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. I'm not going to really talk about this because there is going to be a group that presentation group which will cover the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. There's the Church of the Latter-day Dude. So I don't know if you've seen the movie The Big Lebowski, which came out, I think, in 1998, starring Jeff Bridges. There's a guy named the Dude, right? And the dude was he would spend his days drinking White Russians and bowling and living this sort of free lifestyle. Well, the parody religion grew up around it called the Church of the Latter-day Dude. This is from their website, sort of their creed. The idea is this: life is short, complicated, nobody knows what to do about it, so don't do anything about it. Just take it easy, man. Stop worrying so much whether you'll make it into the finals. Kick back. I guess he was talking about finals and bowling finals. Kick back with some friends and some oat soda, and whether you roll strikes or gutters, do your best to be true to yourself and others. That is to say, abide. All right. So if you want to, become a pastor for the Church of the Latter-day Dude, all you have to do is go onto their website, sign up, and in many states you can perform weddings, just like the pastors for the Church of the Subgenius. So it's a parody religion, but also you could make the argument if you read this, what he's advocating, or what the dude, I guess, in the organization and the voice of the dude is advocating, is a form of Wu Wei, right? Non-action, just going with the flow that we saw with Taoism. So you can see this as a Buddhism, Church of Latter-day Dude, as a form of non-realist Taoism. This is a new one. Maybe it's about 20 years old, 15 years old, sort of sprung out of the Pirate Bay file sharing, illegal file sharing thing in Sweden. This is the Missionary Church of Copymism. And they're all based around this idea of copying. Right? Copying and distributing information is sacred. And all right, so their symbols, this should not control P, but control C for copying. I guess that should be control V for paste. All right, so this copymism says, that's, copying is the most natural sacred thing there is. Like all life is created and recreated through essentially copying genes, right? So they advocate for the copying and free distribution of all information. So they would say that downloading movies from the internet is not illegal, even though it is illegal, can be illegal if you're not paying for them. That it's a religious thing. It's a religious right because they're engaging in copying. They, like the other groups, like the Spaghetti Monster and the Latter-day Dude, you can become a pastor in the Church of Copymism and perform legal marriages, right? So still, I mean, it's interesting. These new religious, they, in a sense, are new religious movements that start as parody religions, but we'll see more and more they start to look like real religions. I mean, the line blurs between satire and belief. Okay, so I am going to leave it there. If you do watch this and you have any questions about this, feel free to email me or talk to me when we get back from the Thanksgiving break. Okay. All right. Have a good break.